People have always asked big questions. Where did we come from? What happens when we die? Why does the world sometimes feel orderly, and at other times completely chaotic? Long before science, before writing, and before philosophy as we know it, humans were already struggling with these mysteries. Religion was one of the first tools they created to answer them. But unlike a tool that can be put aside when something better comes along, religion built itself into the fabric of culture, power, and identity. To understand why religions were created, we have to step back and look at what people needed at the time, and what they still felt they needed even after the world started to make more sense through reason and evidence. When you think about the earliest humans, they lived in small groups vulnerable to hunger, disease, predators, and weather. They didn't have reliable explanations for why the rain stopped, why crops failed, or why someone suddenly died from an unseen illness. In that space of fear and uncertainty, stories grew. A story that says lightning is the anger of a sky god is far more emotionally satisfying than saying, "We don't know." Not knowing leaves people anxious. A story, even if it's wrong, feels like control. Religion wasn't born out of malice. It was born out of the deep human need to reduce uncertainty. But uncertainty wasn't the only driver. Religion also emerged as a way to bind people together. When a group of hunter-gatherers believes they share the same sacred ancestors or protective spirits, that belief strengthens cooperation. A tribe that believes its rules come from the gods can enforce those rules more effectively than a tribe that says, "We made these rules ourselves." If someone violates a man-made rule, they can argue with it. If someone violates what's believed to be a divine command, the consequences feel cosmic. Religion gave early societies a glue stronger than human opinion. It tied morality to the supernatural, making the rules harder to question. This connection between gods and morality explains a lot about why religions didn't fade away once people started farming, trading, and building cities. In fact, the opposite happened. As societies grew larger, they needed more sophisticated systems to keep people in line. You can't police thousands of strangers with just kinship bonds. You need shared symbols, rituals, and beliefs to make people act as if they're family. Large-scale religion was like social technology. It allowed cooperation between people who otherwise had no reason to trust each other. Believing that the gods see everything worked as a form of surveillance before cameras and courts existed, but that's only part of the story. Religion also became a way to deal with death, which is perhaps the hardest problem humans face. Knowing that life ends, that loved ones vanish, that our own time is limited, this knowledge is unbearable for many. Promises of an afterlife, of reunion, of eternal justice are powerful comforts. Without them, death feels final. With them, it becomes a transition. Religions offered people not just comfort, but meaning. Suffering wasn't just random, it was a test or punishment or a path to something greater. This didn't make the suffering disappear, but it gave it a frame that made it easier to endure. When you add all these elements together, uncertainty about nature, the need for social order, the fear of death, you can see why religions didn't just appear but flourished. They weren't just beliefs. They were multi-purpose solutions. They explained the world, they organized societies, and they softened existential dread. From that perspective, the creation of religions was almost inevitable. Of course, once religions existed, they didn't remain just harmless stories or coping strategies. They became tools of power. Leaders realized that controlling religious ideas meant controlling people's behavior at the deepest level. It's one thing to command soldiers with threats of punishment. It's another to convince them that the gods themselves demand obedience. That kind of authority is internalized. It doesn't need constant force because people police themselves. Religion gave rulers the ability to govern not only bodies but consciences. And once that power dynamic was established, religion became more than a spontaneous human invention. It became a deliberately shaped institution. Another important reason religions were created is storytelling. Humans are storytelling animals. We remember stories better than abstract facts. Religion provided the ultimate stories, cosmic narratives of beginnings, struggles between good and evil, divine heroes, and promised endings. These stories weren't just entertainment. They structured people's understanding of reality. A myth that the sun was carried across the sky by a god's chariot gave people an explanation they could picture. And once that image took hold, it spread because it was easier to share than a technical explanation. Even today, people find grand narratives emotionally more satisfying than raw data. That instinct was even stronger in ancient times. What's fascinating is that religions often recycled each other's stories. Flood myths appear in different cultures. Dying and rising gods show up across continents. This suggests that religions weren't created from scratch by single geniuses. They were cultural products evolving like languages. Just as languages borrow words and phrases, religions borrowed symbols and myths. They survived not because they were true, but because they were useful and memorable. There's also a psychological dimension to why religions were created. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. Our brains are wired to detect agency, even when none exists. If a bush rustles, it's safer to assume it's an animal than the wind. That bias for seeing intention everywhere spills over into seeing gods, spirits, and invisible forces behind natural events. Psychologists call this hyperactive agency detection. It's the mental habit that once kept us alive in dangerous environments, but it also laid the foundation for belief in supernatural beings. Religion capitalized on that instinct, offering names and personalities for the unseen agents people thought they detected. Closely tied to this is the human tendency to seek fairness. We want to believe that good is rewarded and evil is punished. Yet life doesn't consistently work that way. Bad people often thrive. Good people often suffer. Religion filled that gap by inventing cosmic justice systems. If justice didn't arrive in this life, it would come in the next. This was a brilliant psychological move because it preserved the sense that the universe was fair. Without that, many people would feel despair. With it, they could endure hardship, believing that balance would be restored eventually. All these factors, the fear of death, the need for order, the craving for fairness, the instinct to see patterns and agency, combined into the soil from which religions grew. What's striking is that these needs are universal. That's why every culture has had some form of religion. The details differ, but the functions are remarkably similar. Whether it's ancient Egyptians building elaborate myths of the afterlife, or early Chinese traditions emphasizing ancestor worship, the underlying purposes remain consistent. Religion wasn't about discovering truth. It was about addressing human needs. And yet the creation of religions also came with costs. Once a belief system is established, questioning it becomes dangerous. If people's cooperation depends on shared myths, then doubting those myths threatens social unity. That's why so many religions are hostile to skepticism. They weren't designed to be tested, they were designed to be believed. This feature explains why religions often punish heresy more harshly than crime. A thief disrupts property. A heretic disrupts the shared story that keeps society together. Protecting the story becomes more important than protecting individuals. We can also see how religions reinforced hierarchies. If rulers claimed divine approval, then disobeying them wasn't just rebellion, it was sacrilege. This created stable systems where questioning authority meant questioning the gods. That arrangement was too convenient to be accidental. Rulers, priests, and elites had every reason to cultivate religions, to codify them, to build temples, and to insist that rituals were sacred duties. What may have begun as spontaneous stories and coping mechanisms evolved into carefully managed institutions of control. As religions became institutionalized, they started to shape culture in deeper ways than just belief. They influenced art, laws, family structures, and even how people thought about time. Sacred calendars divided the year into holy and ordinary days. Religious festivals created rhythm in life, marking planting seasons, harvests, and transitions between generations. These rituals weren't arbitrary. They provided predictability in a world that often felt chaotic. If everyone gathered at the same time to perform the same ceremony, it strengthened identity and belonging. The fact that the rituals often made little rational sense didn't matter. What mattered was the shared act, the sense that people were participating in something larger than themselves. But if rituals created unity, they also created boundaries. Religion was not only about who was included, it was also about who was excluded. Belief systems separated us from them, insiders from outsiders, the pure from the impure. This dividing line gave communities a strong sense of identity, but it also sowed the seeds of conflict. Wars, persecutions, and discrimination often sprang from these divisions. Religion promised unity within, but at the price of hostility toward those outside. The creation of religions, then, can't be separated from the creation of enemies. To explain why religions exist, we also have to acknowledge that they offered both cohesion and conflict as part of the same package. Another layer to this story is knowledge. Before the rise of systematic science, religion was the main way knowledge was preserved and passed on. Sacred texts often mixed myth with practical wisdom. Instructions about hygiene, agriculture, or community organization could be embedded in divine commandments. This gave them authority and longevity, but the cost was that myths and outdated rules became frozen in time, treated as eternal truths. What started as pragmatic advice could harden into dogma. That's why even today, centuries after better explanations exist, many religious communities still cling to ancient prescriptions as if they were beyond question. The origins of these texts as survival guides became obscured by the claim that they were timeless revelations. It's also useful to think about how religion served emotional needs beyond fear of death or desire for justice. They offered awe. When early humans looked at the stars, the ocean, or the birth of a child, they felt wonder. Religion took that raw emotion and gave it a container. Gods were written into the stars, spirits were imagined in the oceans, divine blessing was tied to fertility. By embedding awe into religious narratives, communities could both celebrate and control it. Leaders could channel awe into loyalty, making the mysteries of the world proof of divine authority. This way, the feeling of wonder didn't just inspire curiosity, it was redirected into worship. And then there's the role of religion in storytelling about origins. People everywhere want to know where they came from, not just biologically but meaningfully. Myths of creation offered more than just answers. They offered purpose. A world made by gods for humans suggested that existence itself was intentional. This is a powerful contrast to the idea that life arose from impersonal forces. People prefer to feel chosen rather than accidental. Religion was created in part because humans couldn't easily tolerate the thought of being insignificant specks in an indifferent universe. Giving the cosmos a human-centered story made life feel bearable and even important. We should also consider the role of religion in managing uncertainty about the future. Farming societies depended heavily on factors they couldn't control: rainfall, soil fertility, seasonal cycles. Appeasing gods through offerings or sacrifices seemed like a way to influence outcomes. Even when these rituals had no effect, they reduced anxiety by giving people the illusion of control. Modern psychology shows that rituals still function this way. Athletes may perform superstitious routines before a game, not because it changes physics, but because it calms their minds. Religion was the large-scale version of this human tendency. It reassured people that they weren't helpless, that they had some influence over fate. Over time, religions grew more elaborate. They developed priestly classes, complex theologies, and elaborate ceremonies. This wasn't accidental. Specialization gave religion staying power. If ordinary people could only access the gods through trained intermediaries, the system became harder to dismantle. Priests could maintain authority by claiming unique knowledge of sacred rituals. They positioned themselves as gatekeepers to the divine. This monopoly made religion not just a set of beliefs, but a career path, an economy, and a political structure. Once that happened, religions weren't just created by human needs. They were also sustained by human interests. At the same time, religions borrowed and adapted to survive competition. When cultures met through trade or conquest, their gods often merged. Polytheistic systems absorbed new deities with little trouble. Monotheistic religions, on the other hand, competed more fiercely, demanding exclusive loyalty. Both strategies worked in their own ways, but the underlying goal was the same: survival of the belief system. Religions evolved almost like living organisms, adapting to social environments to ensure continuity. This is why they look different across time and place, yet serve remarkably similar roles. Another angle to consider is how religion shaped morality. People sometimes argue that morality came from religion, but in reality, morality came first. Even small-scale societies without organized religion had norms against murder, theft, and betrayal. Cooperation was a survival necessity. What religion did was take those pre-existing rules and sanctify them. By saying morality came from gods, communities made their ethical systems harder to challenge. This was useful politically because it discouraged rebellion and dissent. The moral codes weren't seen as human inventions but as sacred obligations. Religions were created to reinforce morality, not to invent it. And we can't ignore the economic dimension. Temples and churches often became centers of wealth. Offerings, tithes, and sacrifices turned into organized systems of resource collection. These resources funded not only religious buildings but also armies and governments. religion became a financial engine as well as a spiritual one. Its creation wasn't only about answering questions or soothing fears, it was also about concentrating wealth and power in predictable ways. This dynamic explains why rulers often invested so heavily in religious monuments. They weren't just expressions of devotion, they were investments in social stability and control. The psychological benefits of religion also can't be underestimated. Beyond comfort in the face of death, religion gave people identity. To belong to a religion was to belong to a group, to know who you were and what your life meant. That identity could guide daily decisions, shape marriages, and give direction in crises. Without religion, many people felt adrift. This doesn't mean religion provided truth, it means it provided structure. When life was confusing, religion gave clarity. When life was unfair, religion gave reasons. When life was frightening, religion gave promises. These functions are the reason religions not only were created but endured. Even so, we can already see a paradox. The very reasons religions were created, fear, uncertainty, identity, control, also explain why they resist criticism. To challenge a religion is to threaten not only its stories but the psychological and social foundations it supports. That's why questioning gods often feels more dangerous to societies than questioning kings. The gods, after all, were the original creators of order in human imagination. Without them, many feared everything would collapse. That fear, more than truth or evidence, is what kept religions firmly in place once they were created. Once religions were firmly established, they became remarkably adaptable. Every new challenge a society faced could be folded into religious explanations. If a plague struck, it could be explained as divine punishment or a test of faith. If an empire expanded, it was framed as a blessing from the gods. If disaster followed, it was said to be the gods' wrath. This flexibility ensured that religions could survive almost any circumstance. Unlike scientific explanations, which can be disproven, religious explanations could always be adjusted. They were designed to be unfalsifiable. That feature wasn't a flaw in their creation, it was their strength. Another reason religions held on is that they appealed not only to emotions, but to imagination. Human beings naturally think in terms of stories, symbols, and characters. Abstract ideas are harder to grasp. By personifying forces of nature as gods or spirits, religions made the invisible tangible. The wind wasn't just air moving. It was a deity breathing across the earth. The sun wasn't just a star, it was a divine ruler lighting the world. These images gave people something to picture, something to talk to, something to worship. The creation of religions tapped into this deep human need for narrative concreteness. That's why religions often feel vivid, while purely rational explanations can seem cold even if they're more accurate. Religions also developed because they were excellent at passing themselves on. A belief system that promised eternal reward or threatened eternal punishment created a powerful incentive to keep it alive. Parents felt not only cultural but spiritual pressure to raise their children in the faith. To leave the religion wasn't just betrayal of family, it was betrayal of the cosmos. This self-reinforcing mechanism made religions incredibly durable. They weren't just created once. They recreated themselves in every generation through rituals, education, and fear of consequences. That built-in survival mechanism is one of the clearest signs that religions are human inventions designed to replicate. We should also think about how religions addressed loneliness. In large anonymous societies, individuals often felt isolated. Religion gave them a sense of belonging to something infinite. Even if they were poor, forgotten, or marginalized, they could still feel part of a grand story. A temple service, a pilgrimage, or a prayer created the experience of connection. That feeling wasn't about evidence, it was about emotion. And because humans crave community as much as they crave food or shelter, religions offered a psychological lifeline. Their creation was as much about meeting social needs as answering intellectual questions. At the same time, religion functioned as a way to manage guilt and shame. Humans inevitably make mistakes, hurt each other, or break social norms. Religion gave structured ways to deal with that. Through confession, sacrifice, or ritual purification, people could release their guilt. Without such outlets, guilt festers and disrupts relationships. Religion's creation provided an early form of emotional therapy. Of course, it also created guilt in areas where none was necessary, making people feel shame for natural impulses or harmless acts. But the point is that religion offered a system for dealing with the moral weight of being human. That made it deeply appealing and hard to let go. The creation of religions was also tied to power struggles between groups. When one tribe conquered another, merging or replacing gods was often a way to assert dominance. Religion wasn't just belief, it was politics expressed through myth. Victorious cultures didn't simply take land. They imposed their gods to show superiority. Over time, this blending and conquest shaped the religions we recognize today. What looks like pure tradition often hides a long history of political maneuvering. That history tells us that religions were never just about divine inspiration. They were crafted, reshaped, and sometimes imposed to serve human agendas. We can also consider how religion helped people endure inequality. In most societies, wealth and power weren't distributed fairly. Religion stepped in to justify the imbalance. Kings were said to rule by divine right. The poor were told their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. These teachings prevented rebellion and kept social structures intact. Without such justifications, resentment might have boiled over more often. Religion was created not only to explain the unknown, but also to maintain order in unfair systems. That's why so many scriptures encourage obedience and patience rather than resistance. It's revealing that religions often portray the world as a stage for cosmic drama. Life's randomness becomes part of a larger narrative of good versus evil, sin and redemption, fall and salvation. This framing transforms chaos into meaning. A child's death isn't just tragic, it's part of God's plan. A famine isn't just bad luck, it's a divine lesson. These explanations may not be true, but they make unbearable events seem purposeful. That narrative power is one of the main reasons religions were created and embraced. Humans would rather live with a false story that gives meaning than with no story at all. Another striking feature of religion's creation is how it often mirrored human social structures. Gods looked suspiciously like kings, warriors, or parents. Pantheons resembled royal courts with hierarchies, rivalries, and alliances. This wasn't coincidence, it was projection. People built gods in their own image, only bigger and more powerful. Religion was created as an extension of human society into the heavens. That's why divine commands so often resembled the cultural norms of the time. From gender roles to dietary rules. Religion wasn't descending from above, it was ascending from below, carrying human assumptions upward and stamping them with divine authority. Religions also served as memory systems. Before widespread literacy, oral traditions preserved history through sacred stories. Myths often carried kernels of real events, floods, migrations, wars wrapped in supernatural packaging. These stories weren't reliable as records, but they functioned as cultural memory. They told people where they came from, who their ancestors were, and why their community mattered. Religion's creation gave identity a narrative backbone, keeping people tied to their past. In that sense, religion was as much about memory as about meaning. Another underappreciated reason for the creation of religion is aesthetics. Temples, chants, rituals, and sacred art weren't just about belief. They were about beauty. Humans are drawn to music, rhythm, architecture, and spectacle. Religion used these tools to make its messages emotionally irresistible. A doctrine spoken plainly might sound dull, but the same doctrine sung in a hymn or painted in stained glass becomes moving. Religion was created not only as an intellectual framework but as an artistic one. Its survival owes as much to beauty as to theology. If we look at the broad sweep of history, we can see that religions were created wherever humans faced gaps. Gaps in knowledge, gaps in control, gaps in justice, gaps in meaning. In each case, religion filled the void with stories, rituals, and promises. The remarkable thing is not that religions arose, but that people still cling to them long after other tools have outperformed them. That persistence is a testament to how deeply these inventions met psychological and social needs. They weren't just stopgaps. They became woven into human identity. Even so, the very adaptability of religion reveals its human origins. A divine truth wouldn't need constant updating, reinterpretation, or cultural translation, but religions change with the times because they were created by people. They bend under pressure, fracture into sects, and absorb new ideas, just like languages or political systems. This flexibility shows that they are products of human culture, not eternal revelations. If they were truly supernatural, they would not need such continuous maintenance. And here lies perhaps the most important point. Religions were created because humans couldn't stand not knowing, not belonging, not controlling, not mattering. They are monuments to human vulnerability as much as to human creativity. Understanding this doesn't make religions evil. It makes them deeply human. But it also means that they are not necessary once better tools exist. Science can explain the world more accurately. Philosophy can ground morality without myths. Community can be built without exclusion. Art can inspire awe without dogma. The reasons religions were created remain real, but the solutions no longer have to be religious. When we look more closely at the endurance of religions, one of the most striking aspects is how they protect themselves from criticism. A system created by humans, if acknowledged as such, is always open to debate and revision, but religions were designed to place themselves beyond ordinary scrutiny. To question them was framed as not just disagreeing with leaders or traditions, but rebelling against cosmic authority. This framing gave them enormous resilience. By building in the idea that doubt was sinful or dangerous, religions insulated themselves from the very process that could have dismantled them. This wasn't an accident. It was a brilliant survival mechanism woven into their creation. Another feature is how religions exploit memory and repetition. Human brains are wired to learn through patterns. Repeated rituals, songs, and prayers drill ideas into long-term memory far more effectively than abstract reasoning. This is why religious practices are so repetitive and rhythmic. They're not just symbolic acts, they are psychological training methods. When you hear the same chant every week, when you bow or kneel in the same way again and again, it becomes second nature. Religions were created with this kind of reinforcement because leaders recognized, consciously or not, that ritual could carry belief deeper than argument ever could. We can also trace religion's creation through its treatment of morality and justice. While communities needed rules, religion added an ultimate enforcer, an all-seeing God. In small societies, social pressure was enough to keep people in line. But as groups grew larger, it was impossible to monitor everyone. Religion solved this by introducing invisible surveillance. Even if no human saw your actions, a divine being did. This concept made social order possible on a large scale. It's one of the reasons empires leaned so heavily on religion. It allowed rulers to control populations without constant physical enforcement. In that sense, religion was an early form of psychological policing, created to keep order in ways that brute force alone couldn't achieve. And then there's the promise of immortality. The fear of death is universal, and the finality of death is a difficult truth to accept. Religions turned that fear into a story of continuity. The body may die, but the soul lives on. Whether in paradise, reincarnation, or spiritual union, religions offered futures that softened mortality. This was not an accidental feature. It was central to why religions were created. Nothing else provides quite the same comfort as believing that the self will endure. And while many religious traditions differ in detail, their shared promise of life after death shows how deeply this psychological need influenced their creation. Religions also made suffering meaningful. In a purely natural world, pain and loss are simply unfortunate realities. But religion reframed them as part of a grand plan. Suffering could be punishment, purification, or preparation for reward. This interpretation didn't remove pain, but it gave it a narrative, and humans find narratives easier to bear than raw chaos. The creation of religions answered not only intellectual questions but emotional ones. Not just why does the sun rise, but why am I hurting? It's not surprising that people clung to these frameworks, even when they caused new forms of suffering in the process. Looking across cultures, it's clear that the specifics of religion, names of gods, rituals, sacred texts, differ widely, but the underlying functions are nearly identical. That tells us something important. Religions weren't handed down from a single supernatural source. They were created in response to recurring human needs. The gods may look different, but the gaps they fill are the same: knowledge, belonging, control, comfort, identity. If these needs are universal, it makes sense that religion appeared everywhere humans settled. The details are cultural, but the impulse is biological and social. Another revealing sign of religion's human origins is how often doctrines contradict each other, even within the same tradition. If religions had truly been created by divine beings, we might expect consistency. Instead, we find constant revision, schisms, and reinterpretations. Each generation adapts its religion to fit its own concerns, often while claiming it has remained unchanged. This adaptability is exactly what you'd expect from a human invention, not a divine revelation. Religions survive because they evolve, and they evolve because they were created as flexible tools, not fixed truths. Religions were also created because they give leaders a way to channel obedience. A ruler who commands loyalty can be resisted. A god who commands loyalty makes resistance nearly unthinkable. By claiming divine backing, leaders raise their authority beyond negotiation. This dynamic is visible across civilizations, from Egyptian pharaohs to medieval kings to modern political movements with religious undertones. Religion was created as a bridge between power and belief, turning political authority into sacred obligation. It's one of the clearest examples of how religion serves human structures, rather than descending from outside them. Even in times of radical change, religions proved remarkably resilient. When societies moved from oral to written culture, religions adapted by producing scriptures. When science began to explain natural phenomena, religions reinterpreted their myths symbolically rather than abandoning them. When political revolutions threatened religious authority, religions rebranded themselves as moral guides rather than rulers. This ability to morph shows their human origins. A divine truth wouldn't need to keep adjusting. A human invention does, and religions have done so continuously to remain relevant. It's also important to see that religions were created not only to answer questions, but to prevent questions. By declaring certain topics sacred or forbidden, religions set boundaries around curiosity. This restriction helped preserve authority and prevent destabilizing challenges. While curiosity drives science and philosophy forward, religion often grew by limiting it. That too is a sign of its origins, not in divine wisdom, but in human desire for stability and control. Today, when we study anthropology, psychology, and history, the reasons religions were created become even clearer. They were responses to fear of death, to the need for social cohesion, to the desire for justice, to the power of ritual, to the love of story, and to the utility of control. None of these require gods to explain. They require only human minds, human vulnerabilities, and human creativity. Religion is one of humanity's greatest inventions, but it is still an invention. Understanding this doesn't diminish the role religion played in shaping civilizations. It acknowledges it honestly. Religion gave structure when little else could. It gave meaning when science had not yet developed. It gave community when isolation was dangerous. But its creation was never about eternal truths. It was about survival, identity, and control. Once those needs can be met in better ways, religion loses its necessity. What remains is the recognition that religions were created, not discovered, and that their power lies not in divine origin but in human imagination. And that brings us back to the original question: why were religions created? They were created because people needed them, not because gods whispered to humanity, but because humanity whispered to itself, creating stories, rituals, and rules to survive in a vast and frightening world. They were created because people couldn't accept silence, chance, or uncertainty. They were created to make sense of the unknown, to make the unbearable bearable, and to turn human weakness into human strength. They are human answers to human problems, brilliant, flawed, powerful, and entirely our own.